I found out my fiancé was sleeping with my sister 4 weeks before our wedding, and I found out the way you find out most things you were never supposed to find out, by accident, at exactly the wrong hour of the night, holding a phone that wasn't mine to be holding. I didn't scream. I want you to understand that first, because most people expect to scream in this part of the story, and I didn't have one in me. I sat down on the edge of a bed I would never sleep in again, and I read every message twice, slowly, the way you read something you're hoping will change its meaning on the second pass. It didn't. 9 years later, a hospital in another state called me with a request so specific, so impossible, that for a long moment I genuinely thought someone had dialed the wrong number. It hadn't been dialed wrong. The two people who broke me apart at 26 were the same two people who needed me, urgently and without a single other option left, at 35. And what I decided to do about that is the part of this story I still think about more than the betrayal itself. Welcome back to Calm Stories Time, where we believe that forgiveness is never owed to anyone, that it's a thing you build entirely for yourself, on your own timeline, and that the people who hurt you the worst rarely get to choose when or how you finally set that weight down. If you've ever loved two people who ended up choosing each other over you, I want you to stay with me for this one, because I promise you, there's a version of peace waiting at the end of it that I never once expected to find. I found out my fiancé was sleeping with my sister 4 weeks before our wedding, and I found out the way you find out most things you were never supposed to find out, by accident, at exactly the wrong hour of the night, holding a phone that wasn't mine to be holding. I didn't scream. I want you to understand that first, because most people expect to scream in this part of the story, and I didn't have one in me. I sat down on the edge of a bed I would never sleep in again, and I read every message twice, slowly, the way you read something you're hoping will change its meaning on the second pass. It didn't. 9 years later, a hospital in another state called me with a request so specific, so impossible, that for a long moment I genuinely thought someone had dialed the wrong number. It hadn't been dialed wrong. The two people who broke me apart at 26 were the same two people who needed me, urgently and without a single other option left, at 35. And what I decided to do about that is the part of this story I still think about more than the betrayal itself. Welcome back to Calm Stories Time, where we believe that forgiveness is never owed to anyone, that it's a thing you build entirely for yourself, on your own timeline, and that the people who hurt you the worst rarely get to choose when or how you finally set that weight down. If you've ever loved two people who ended up choosing each other over you, I want you to stay with me for this one, because I promise you, there's a version of peace waiting at the end of it that I never once expected to find. I met Marcus when I was 23, at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, and I want to be honest about how it started, because I think it matters to understanding everything that came after it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a lightning bolt kind of falling in love. It was slow and steady and, in the specific way the best relationships often are, built almost entirely out of ordinary Tuesday nights and quiet routines, and by the time he proposed, on a hiking trail we'd walked a dozen times before, 3 years into being together, it felt less like a leap and more like the natural next sentence in a story we'd already been writing. Vanessa and Marcus got along well from the beginning, the way I'd always hoped the two most important people in my life would, and for a long time, I remember feeling a specific kind of relief about that. The quiet satisfaction of watching the different rooms of your life fit together without friction. Vanessa was around often, especially in the last year before the wedding, helping with venue visits, dress fittings, seating charts, the 100 small logistical things a wedding requires that are easier to carry with someone who knows you well enough to carry them without being asked. I never once thought to question how much time the two of them ended up spending together during that stretch, because questioning it wasn't a category that existed in my mind at all. I trusted my sister completely. I trusted my fiancé completely. And it never once occurred to me that the explanation for the growing distance I'd started to feel from both of them, separately, in the months before the wedding, might be that they were no longer separate from each other at all. The night I found out started as an ordinary one, which I think is part of why it stayed with me so specifically. Marcus had left his phone charging on the kitchen counter while he showered, and a text notification lit up the screen from a name saved under a nickname I didn't recognize, one that, when I picked the phone up simply to move it off a wet counter, I realized, with a slow, sinking kind of dread, actually belonged to my sister. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because I've thought about it many times since. I didn't set out to go looking for anything. I simply saw enough of that first message, sitting there in plain view, to understand that I needed to see the rest of it, and once I started reading, I couldn't make myself stop. What I found, over the following 20 minutes, sitting on the edge of a bed I'd shared with him for 3 years, was a relationship that had apparently been unfolding, carefully and quietly, for close to 8 months, conducted almost entirely in the exact windows of time I would have had no reason to suspect anything, the wedding planning errands, the girls' weekend Vanessa had taken alone the previous spring that Marcus had, it turned out, driven up to join for 2 of the 3 nights. I read messages that were tender in a way that made my stomach turn, plans made for after the wedding was handled, language so casually cruel in its practicality that I understood, reading it, that this wasn't a single moment of weakness either of them had stumbled into. It was a decision, made and remade, over and over, for the better part of a year, by 2 people who had looked at me clearly enough to know exactly what they were doing to me, and had done it anyway. Marcus came out of the shower to find me still sitting there, the phone in my lap, and I remember, with a clarity that has never left me, the specific way his face changed the moment he understood what I was holding, not confusion, not the startled innocence of someone falsely accused, but the flat, resigned recognition of someone who had simply been caught doing something he'd always known, somewhere underneath everything. He would eventually get caught doing. He didn't deny it. I want to give him that much credit even now, even after everything. He sat down across from me and told me the truth, in pieces, in the kind of halting, apologetic language that manages to sound like remorse while still, somehow, offering almost no actual explanation for why any of it had happened at all. I called Vanessa that same night, and I remember, more than anything else about that call, the specific silence on the other end of the line once I said what I'd found, a silence that lasted just long enough to tell me everything I needed to know before she ever said a single word. She didn't deny it either. What she said instead, through tears that I understood even in that moment, were at least partly genuine, was that it had just happened, that she'd never meant for any of it, that she loved me and hated herself and had no idea how to have ever told me. I asked her, because I genuinely needed to know, how long she had planned to let me walk down an aisle toward a man she was sleeping with, and she didn't have an answer to that question that made any of it easier to hold. If you've ever had the 2 people you trusted most in the world choose each other over you, and needed somewhere calm to sit with that tonight, hit subscribe to Calm Stories Time right now, because I promise you, this story does eventually find its way somewhere worth arriving at. I cancelled the wedding myself, for weeks out, which meant absorbing almost the entirety of the non-refundable costs on a deposit my parents and I had split, calling a caterer and a florist and a string quartet to explain, as plainly as I could manage, that there would be no wedding after all. I want to be honest about how mechanical that stretch of time felt, because I think people expect a dramatic collapse in moments like that, and what I actually experienced was something quieter and, in its own way, more disorienting. A kind of numb, functional efficiency that let me handle logistics while the actual grief waited somewhere just underneath the surface, patient, for the moment I finally stopped moving long enough to let it in. My parents, when I told them what had happened, reacted in ways that surprised me in opposite directions. My father was, immediately and without complication, entirely on my side, furious at both of them in a way that felt, honestly, like the only uncomplicated comfort I had in those first weeks. My mother's response was harder to sit with, not because she defended what Vanessa had done, but because I watched her, almost immediately, begin the quiet, painful work of trying to figure out how the family could survive this without permanently losing one daughter to protect the other, a math problem I understood, even through my own devastation, that she had no good way to solve. Vanessa reached out, repeatedly, in the weeks after, first through messages I didn't answer, then through a handwritten letter my mother delivered on her behalf, one I read exactly once and then put in a drawer I didn't open again for years. I want to be honest about what was in it, because I think it matters. It wasn't an excuse. She didn't try to explain the affair away as something that had simply happened to her. What she wrote, instead, was that she understood if I never forgave her, that she loved Marcus in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't undo, and that she would live with having done this to me for the rest of her life whether I ever spoke to her again or not. I remember reading it and feeling, underneath the anger, a small, unwelcome flicker of recognition, the understanding that my sister, whatever else she'd done, wasn't lying about how much this had cost her too. It didn't make it easier. It just made it more complicated than I wanted it to be. I moved out of the apartment Marcus and I had shared within 3 weeks, into a spare room at a college friend's place 2 hours away, close enough to still technically be near my family, far enough that I stopped running into people who'd been invited to a wedding that no longer existed. I took an extended leave from the marketing job I'd been working since college, one I'd never particularly loved, and spent the first 2 months of that stretch doing very little beyond the specific, exhausting work of simply getting through each individual day, because that was genuinely all I had the capacity for. It was my college friend, watching me during that period, who first suggested, almost offhandedly, that I think about nursing, a field she was already working in herself and one I'd never seriously considered, not because I lacked the aptitude for it, but because I'd simply never pictured myself inside it. I remember laughing the first time she brought it up, the specific, hollow laugh of someone who can't imagine caring about anything again, let alone caring for other people professionally. But something about the idea stayed with me in the weeks that followed, quietly, the way ideas sometimes do when you're not paying close enough attention to notice them taking root, and by the following spring, I'd enrolled in an accelerated nursing program, using savings I'd once earmarked for a wedding that never happened. Marcus and Vanessa got married a little over a year after everything came apart, a fact I learned secondhand, through my mother, in a phone call I remember specifically because I was standing in a hospital cafeteria on a break from my first clinical rotation when it came through. I want to be honest about how that news landed, because I think it surprised me more than it should have. I'd known, somewhere underneath everything, that this was where it was likely heading. Knowing it and hearing it confirmed, in a single sentence, delivered gently by a mother trying not to hurt me further, turned out to be 2 very different things to carry. I didn't go to the wedding, obviously, and I didn't speak to either of them for the better part of the next 4 years, a silence I maintained deliberately, not out of ongoing rage exactly, but out of the specific, protective instinct you develop when you've learned, the hard way, that dwelling on something you can't change only deepens a wound that's already trying to close. My mother stayed in contact with Vanessa throughout that stretch, careful never to bring news of her to me unless I asked, which I mostly didn't. My father, for years, barely spoke to Vanessa at all, a rupture in their relationship that I know, even now, weighs on both of them more than either has ever fully admitted out loud. I finished my nursing program a little over 2 years after the affair, graduated near the top of my cohort, in a specific, quiet way I've never stopped being proud of, given the state I'd been in when I started it, and took a position in a busy general medical unit at a hospital about 90 minutes from where I'd grown up, far enough to keep building a life that felt entirely mine, close enough to still see my parents on holidays without much difficulty. I was good at the work almost immediately, in the same steady, attentive way I'd once been good at handling every logistical detail of a wedding that never happened, and within 18 months, a nurse manager I'd built a good relationship with suggested I consider transplant nursing specifically, a specialty she thought suited both my clinical instincts and what she called, kindly, my unusual patience with hard things. I moved into a transplant coordination fellowship about 3 years after the affair, a program that trains nurses specifically in the medical and logistical complexity of organ transplantation, from donor matching through post-operative recovery, and I want to be honest that I didn't choose that specialty for any poetic reason connected to my own history. I chose it because I was good at the specific kind of calm the work demanded, the ability to sit with families in the worst moments of their lives and hold steady enough to actually be useful to them. It was only later, much later, that I understood how directly that skill had been built out of the exact thing that had once broken me. I built, over those years, an entirely new life out of the wreckage of the old one, the way people sometimes do when the alternative to rebuilding simply isn't survivable. I made new friends who knew me only as the careful, competent transplant nurse I'd become, with no context for the woman who'd once cancelled a wedding 4 weeks before it happened. I dated, cautiously, over time, without ever quite letting anyone all the way in, a pattern I understood, even as I lived inside it, but wasn't yet ready to change. I didn't forget what had happened. I simply learned to carry it quietly, the specific way you learn to carry anything you've decided you're no longer willing to let run your life. If you've ever had to rebuild an entire life out of a betrayal you never saw coming, hit subscribe to Calm Stories time right now, because what happened next in this story is the part one still find hardest to fully explain, even to myself. 9 years after the night I found that phone on a wet counter, I was 35 years old, 5 years into my career as a transplant coordinator at a regional medical center 2 states away from where I'd grown up, when a call came through my hospital's transplant office from a nephrologist at a facility in the state my parents still lived in. I want to explain, before I go further, exactly how transplant matching works, because the mechanics of what happened next only make sense once you understand it. When a patient needs a kidney and no compatible living donor is immediately available, hospitals sometimes reach out to specialized transplant centers, and occasionally, in patients with unusually specific tissue matching profiles, to registries and family contact records connected to the patient's own file, hoping to locate biological relatives who might not yet have been tested. I didn't recognize the patient's name on the initial intake summary that landed in my queue, routed to me simply because I happened to be the coordinator on call handling out-of-network living donor inquiries that week, a routine part of my job I'd done dozens of times before without a second thought. It was only when I opened the file fully, scanning the patient's listed emergency contacts, that I saw it, a name I hadn't seen written down in 9 years. Vanessa Collins Mercer. My sister, in end-stage kidney failure, from a genetic condition none of us had known she carried, listed under the married name she'd taken from the man I'd once been 4 weeks from marrying myself. I sat with that file open on my screen for what felt like a very long time before I did anything at all. I want to be honest with you about the specific, disorienting shock of it, because 9 years is a long time to build distance from something, and I genuinely believed, until that exact moment, that I'd built enough of it to never be pulled back in this directly. The notes in the file explained the situation plainly, in the clinical, unemotional language medical records are written in. Vanessa's kidney function had been declining for close to 2 years, initially attributed to a treatable condition before genetic testing revealed something rarer and more serious, a hereditary kidney disease that, the notes indicated, ran in families and carried meaningful implications for close biological relatives, meaning me, and meaning, more urgently, her 3-year-old daughter, a niece I had never once met. I did exactly what I was professionally obligated to do the moment I understood the personal connection, which was disclose it immediately, in writing, to my supervising physician and the hospital's transplant ethics coordinator, explaining that the patient in question was my biological sister, that significant personal history existed between us, and that I needed to be formally recused from any direct involvement in her case, both to protect her from any appearance of undue influence and to protect myself from being asked to make clinical decisions about someone I could not possibly view with full objectivity. My hospital, to their credit, took the disclosure seriously and immediately reassigned the file to a colleague, while offering me the option, entirely at my discretion, of being formally contacted as a potential living donor candidate should preliminary testing suggest I might be a viable match, a possibility the intake notes had flagged given my listed status as a biological sibling. I told them, that same day, that I needed time before I could answer that question, and I want to be honest that in the moment I said it, I genuinely did not know which way I would eventually decide. The call from Marcus came 4 days later, to a personal cell number I hadn't changed in 11 years, one he must have still had saved from a life we'd once shared. I almost didn't answer it, staring at his name on my screen for the first time in 9 years, feeling something I couldn't fully name, not quite anger, not quite grief, something closer to the specific, hollow vertigo of hearing from someone you'd built an entire new life at a careful distance from. I answered. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, and it wasn't curiosity either. It was simply the understanding, sitting there with my sister's transplant file still fresh in my memory, that whatever he was calling about was almost certainly connected to something far more urgent than either of us. He was quieter on the phone than I remembered him being, 9 years earlier, older in his voice in a way that surprised me, and he told me, in careful, halting sentences, what I already partly knew, that Vanessa's kidneys were failing, that they'd exhausted the local matching options, that neither he nor either of Vanessa's own 2 children, one from their marriage and one, I learned in that same call, that Vanessa had had with someone before Marcus, were compatible donors, and that the transplant team's early genetic screening had flagged me, specifically, as a biological sibling with a notably strong preliminary match profile, the kind of match that, in kidney transplantation, meaningfully improves both the surgery's success rate and the organ's long-term function once transplanted. He didn't ask me for the kidney directly, not in that first call, and I want to give him credit for that, because I think he understood, even through his own desperation, that it wasn't a request either of us could make lightly over the phone. What he told me instead, his voice breaking in a way I hadn't expected and found harder to sit with than I wanted to admit, was that their daughter, Emma, 3 years old and entirely unaware of any of the history sitting underneath this moment, kept asking, every day, when her mommy was going to feel better, and that he didn't know, if Vanessa's kidneys continued to fail without a transplant, how much longer he'd have an honest answer to give her. I told him I needed time, the same thing I'd told my own hospital days earlier, and I hung up the phone and sat in my apartment for a long time afterward, feeling the specific, complicated collision of 2 entirely separate parts of my life crashing into each other after 9 careful years of keeping them apart. I want to be honest about the anger that surfaced in me that night, because I think it would be dishonest to pretend it didn't. Some part of me, sitting there, felt the specific, bitter unfairness of being asked, after everything, to be the one who saved them, as though the 2 people who had once taken something enormous from me were now, in the cruelest possible symmetry, the ones asking me to give them something even larger in return. If you've ever had to decide whether to help the person who once hurt you the most, hit subscribe to Calm Stories Time right now, because I promise you, the way I finally made peace with that decision surprised even me. I called my mother the next morning, the first real, extended conversation we'd had about Vanessa in years, and I want to be honest that some part of me had already known, before I even dialed, that I wasn't calling for advice on what to decide. I was calling because I needed to hear out loud, from someone who loved both of us, what this actually meant, medically and otherwise, before I let myself think any further about it. My mother, gently, without pushing me in either direction, told me what she knew, that Vanessa had been sick for almost 2 years, that she'd kept most of it quiet even from their own parents until it became impossible to, out of what my mother believed, and what I came to believe myself later, was a specific, painful shame about ever having to ask me, of all people, for anything again. I spent the following 2 weeks doing what I do professionally for other families every day, researching living kidney donation outcomes with a clinical thoroughness I'd never had to apply to my own body before, reading about surgical risk, recovery time, long-term health implications for donors, the specific, sobering reality that donating a kidney is not a small or reversible decision, made lightly, out of guilt or obligation, but one that has to be made, if it's made honestly, entirely on the donor's own terms. I want to be honest about the version of myself that almost said no. There were nights during those 2 weeks where the old anger resurfaced with a clarity that startled me, the specific, visceral memory of sitting on the edge of a bed 9 years earlier reading messages that told me exactly how little either of them had considered me while making the choices that shaped the rest of my life. I thought, more than once, about a version of this story where I simply told the hospital I wasn't a candidate and let someone else's search continue without me, and I want to be clear that I don't think that version of the decision would have made me a worse person. I think it would have made me a person protecting something she was entitled to protect. What changed it, in the end, wasn't Marcus, and it wasn't even fully Vanessa. It was a phone call I made, hesitantly, to my mother, asking if she could send me a single photo of my niece, a 3-year-old girl I had never met, who existed entirely because of a betrayal that had once ended my old life, and who had absolutely nothing to do with any decision either of her parents had made 9 years before she was born. I looked at that photo for a long time, a small girl with Vanessa's exact same eyes, entirely innocent of the history sitting underneath her own existence, and I understood, sitting with it, that whatever I decided next needed to be about her, and about the sister I still, underneath everything, hadn't fully stopped loving, rather than about punishing two people for something that had already cost me 9 years of my life either way. I called my hospital's transplant office the following Monday and told them I was ready to move forward with full donor compatibility testing. The testing process took just over 3 weeks, conducted, per protocol, at a transplant center independent of both my own hospital and the one treating Vanessa, to ensure a fully unbiased evaluation of my candidacy as a donor. I want to be honest about how strange it felt, sitting on the other side of a process I'd guided dozens of patients and families through professionally, now experiencing it entirely from the inside, the blood draws, the imaging, the extensive psychological evaluation every living donor is required to complete before ever being cleared for surgery, one specifically designed to confirm, as thoroughly as a conversation can confirm, that the decision is being made freely, without coercion, and with full understanding of what it actually means. I met with the evaluating psychologist twice, and I told her, both times, the entire history, the affair, the cancelled wedding, the 9 years of distance, because I understood, professionally as much as personally, that a donation made out of unresolved guilt or obligation rather than genuine willingness isn't actually a safe or sustainable decision for anyone involved. She asked me, directly, in our second session, whether I was doing this because I felt I owed it to them. I remember sitting with that question for a long moment before answering honestly that I wasn't, that I was doing it because of a 3-year-old girl I'd seen exactly one photograph of, and because some part of me, underneath 9 years of careful distance, still hadn't stopped being Vanessa's sister, whatever else had happened between us. The testing confirmed what the preliminary genetic screening had suggested, that I was, in fact, a strong compatibility match, close enough that the transplant team described the odds of finding an unrelated match this favorable through the standard donor registry as unlikely. Possibly a matter of additional years on a waiting list Vanessa's declining kidney function genuinely did not have the time to withstand. I was formally cleared as a living donor candidate a little over a month after that first phone call from Marcus, and surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks later, at a transplant center roughly equidistant between where I lived and where Vanessa and Marcus had settled, a piece of logistical neutrality I was quietly, deeply grateful for. I saw Vanessa in person for the first time in 9 years 4 days before the surgery, at a mandatory joint preoperative consultation neither of us could avoid attending together. I want to be honest about how unprepared I was for what that actually felt like, walking into a small consultation room and seeing my sister for the first time since I was 26, visibly thinner than I remembered her, tired in a way illness makes a person tired, and unmistakably, painfully still exactly the person I'd grown up with underneath all of it. Neither of us said very much in that first meeting, beyond the clinical logistics the appointment required, but I remember her reaching for my hand at the very end of it, hesitant, uncertain whether I'd let her, and I remember, after a long moment, letting her. If you've ever had to find your way back to someone through the hardest version of forgiveness there is, hit subscribe to Calm Stories time right now, because the surgery itself is only part of what this story still has left to tell you. The surgery went exactly the way transplant surgeries are supposed to go when everything aligns as favorably as ours did, a little over 4 hours combined between the donor and recipient procedures, performed simultaneously in adjoining operating rooms by 2 coordinated surgical teams. I want to be honest about the physical recovery, because I think people sometimes underestimate it. Donating a kidney is a significant surgery, and my own recovery took several weeks longer than I'd expected, weeks I spent, somewhat unexpectedly, staying in my parents' house for the first time since I was 22, in a bedroom down the hall from the one I'd grown up in, being cared for, slowly and carefully, by a mother who I think had been quietly hoping for years for a reason to have both her daughters under one roof again, even one built out of circumstances this complicated. Vanessa's recovery, on the medical side, went well almost immediately, the transplanted kidney functioning strongly from the first days after surgery, in the specific, quietly miraculous way a successful transplant sometimes does. I visited her twice during my own recovery, brief, careful visits, neither of us quite ready yet for anything beyond gentle, surface-level conversation, but I remember the second visit specifically, because it was the first time I met Emma in person, a small, curious 3-year-old who had no context whatsoever for the complicated history standing in the room around her, who simply looked up at me at one point and asked, with the specific bluntness only small children have, whether I was the Aunt who'd given her mommy a new kidney. I told her I was. She considered that for a moment with great seriousness and then asked if I wanted to see her drawing of a dinosaur, and I found myself, for the first time in longer than I could remember, laughing in a way that had absolutely nothing complicated underneath it at all. I spoke with Marcus only briefly during that stretch, mostly logistical conversations about scheduling and recovery, and I want to be honest that I still haven't found, even now, a version of a relationship with him that feels entirely resolved. I don't think I owe him one. What I've settled into instead is something more limited and, I think, more honest, a careful, distant civility built almost entirely around our shared connection to Vanessa and to Emma, rather than any pretense of the friendship we might once, in a very different life, have eventually built as brother and sister-in-law. My relationship with Vanessa has taken longer to rebuild, and I want to be honest that it isn't fully rebuilt even now, close to a year after the surgery. We talk regularly, carefully, the way you talk to someone you're still learning how to trust again after trust has been broken in a way this specific and this deep. She's apologized to me more times than I can count since the surgery, in ways that feel different now than the letter she once sent 9 years ago, less about asking me to absolve her and more, I think, about simply needing me to know she understands exactly what she took from me, even now, even after I've given her something this large in return. I've told her, honestly, that I forgive her, and I want to be clear about what I mean by that, because I think forgiveness gets misunderstood. I don't mean I've forgotten what happened, or that the 9 years it cost me simply stopped matching the moment I agreed to help her. I mean that I've stopped needing her to suffer in order for me to feel like what happened to me mattered, and that, for me, has turned out to be the actual finish line, the one I spent 9 years, without fully realizing it, quietly working my way toward. It's been a little over a year now since the surgery, and I still work in transplant nursing, though I've found myself, in the months since, thinking differently about the work than I used to, less as a career I fell into out of necessity after everything fell apart, and more as something that ended up circling back, in a way I never could have predicted, to save the two people whose choices once set that entire path into motion. I don't take every case personally. I couldn't do this work if I did. But I understand, in a way very few of my colleagues do, exactly what it costs a family to sit in the room I once sat in myself, on both sides of it now, the one asking and the one being asked. I see Emma every few months now, a standing arrangement Vanessa and I built slowly, carefully, without either of us ever fully naming what it meant that I wanted to be part of her life. She calls me her kidney aunt, a phrase Marcus apparently coined as a joke early on that stuck permanently, and I want to be honest that hearing a 5-word phrase like that out of a small child's mouth has done more to heal something in me than 9 years of careful distance ever managed to on its own. My relationship with my parents is stronger now than it's been since before any of this happened, rebuilt slowly in the specific, deliberate way you rebuild anything that's been fractured for a long time, and I think, honestly, that watching both their daughters find a way back to each other, however complicated and however long it took, gave them something neither of them had quietly stopped hoping for the entire 9 years in between. I haven't fully rebuilt a relationship with Marcus, and I don't know if I ever fully will, and I've made peace with that being an acceptable place to land. Some things, once broken in a specific enough way, simply don't return to their old shape, even once everything underneath them has genuinely been repaired. What I have instead is something I never expected to have again after that night 9 years ago, sitting on the edge of a bed, reading messages that told me exactly how little I'd mattered to the two people I trusted most. I have my sister back, in a slower, more honest form than the one I lost, and I have a niece who has absolutely no idea how close she came to never getting the chance to ask her aunt about dinosaur drawings, and I have, finally, after 9 years of carrying it alone, a version of peace I built entirely on my own terms, on my own timeline, that nobody handed to me and nobody can take back. What I want to leave you with, more than the specific details of a kidney transplant or the surprising math of how forgiveness sometimes finds you exactly when you're least expecting it, is this. I never once decided to help them in order to prove anything, to them or to myself. I decided because a photograph of a 3-year-old girl reminded me that the people who hurt us are rarely as simple as the worst thing they ever did, and that holding on to anger long after it stopped serving you isn't strength, it's just a heavier version of the same wound, carried for longer than it ever needed to be. If you are holding on to something right now, a betrayal that reshaped your whole life, a person you loved who chose someone else over you, I want you to hear me say that you are never obligated to forgive anyone on anyone else's timeline but your own. But if the day ever comes when forgiving them turns out to be the thing that finally sets you free instead of them, I hope you let yourself take it. That's my story. A wedding that never happened, 9 years of a life I built entirely on my own, and a phone call I almost didn't answer that gave me back a sister, a niece, and a version of peace I never once thought I'd get to have. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to decide whether the people who hurt you still deserved your help, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my position. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe to Calm Stories Time, because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told, and I don't want you to miss the next one. I'll see you there.